When we work with Docker images, we are actually dealing with something that needs to be stored, shared, and reused across different environments. Whether it's your local machine, a CI/CD pipeline, or a production server, you will need to deal with these different Docker images. And that's where the Docker Registries come in. A Docker registry is like a cloud-based library or repository where Docker images are stored. You can think of it as the application store for container images. You can push your own images in there and pull images that other people have built. The most popular and default registry used by Docker is Docker Hub. In our example, we do have our image right here, and we have our production environment, and we want to deploy this Docker image. We want to run this Docker image in a running Docker container in our production environment. In here, we are using Kubernetes. So every time we make a change in our code right here, we are going to create a new version of the Docker image, and we want to deploy this new version in our production server. We could just copy the image from our development environment and paste the image in our production environment. But the problem is, what if we have 2 or 3 different production environments in here? Perhaps we have a QA environment and then staging and then production. So every time you need to update your application in any of these environments, you will need to copy and paste your Docker images from your development environment and copy them to each individual environment where you want to use them. Every image has a path that you need to use and you need to remember. The path is the server, then the username, or also called the namespace. Then you have the repository. In this case, we are talking about a public repository. And finally, we have the tag. We can use docker.io/library/golang, and we want to fetch the latest tag. So we could execute docker pull docker.io/library/golang, and we are fetching from Docker Hub. In this case, docker.io/library is the server and namespace for Docker Hub. Now, if you don't specify the server and the namespace or the username, Docker will assume that you are using Docker Hub and you are using the public library. So whenever you execute docker pull and you pass the name of the image, what you are doing under the hood is this exact same thing in here. You are using docker.io as the server, library as the username or the namespace, and in here, since you're not passing anything, you will be using latest. So doing this, docker pull golang, is the exact same thing as doing this and passing latest right here as the tag. You can see right here, if we execute docker pull and we use golang, using default tag latest, so we are using the tag latest in here, and you can see that we are fetching from docker.io/library/golang. So this is the full path of the image that we are pulling. If you perform docker pull and just pass this path, you are going to download the exact same image that you downloaded before. You can see the digest here, the signature ends in C817, the same you have in here. So doing docker pull golang or doing docker pull docker.io/library/golang and latest is the exact same thing. If you don't pass the server, the namespace, and the tag, Docker will assume that you are fetching from docker.io/library and always using the latest tag. And as you can see, this is a public repository in here. So Golang repository is public. In Docker Registries, you have one repository for each Docker image that you are working with. You cannot and you should not store more than one Docker image in the same repository under the same name. Because as you can see, whenever we pull this image right here, we are expecting to pull the Golang image, not any other image in there. So each repository will hold one image at a time. Now, what if the repository is private? In this case, for example, if we try to fetch from docker.io/leondevs/dockerbasics, that is one private repository that I just created in Docker Hub, we could pull exactly as we said before, putting the server / the username or the namespace / the repository we want to fetch, and here we can pass latest. Whenever we try to do this, this will break. And the reason is because this is a private repository. So in this case, we need to authenticate against this server with this username in order to access any of the repositories inside this server and this username. In Docker, you have a command called docker login where you specify the username and you can specify the server. If you don't pass the server, Docker will assume that you are authenticating with Docker Hub. So you could execute Docker login, passing the U flag with Leon Devs being the user, and then the server. Or you can pass Docker login with just the username with no server at all in here, and Docker will assume that you are using Docker.io, because you will assume all the time that you are interacting with Docker Hub. This will authenticate your user to interact with private repositories inside this server and this username. Exactly as you have Docker login, you can perform Docker logout. And in this case, the logout requires the server where you want to log out. So as you can see, you cannot log out from a specific user. You need to log out from a whole server. So let's see this in action. You can see right here under repositories in Docker Hub, we have this namespace for Leon Devs. And here you can see all the repositories. Here we have Leon Devs / Docker Basics, and this is a private repository, as you can see right here. If we go to a terminal and we try to pull Docker pull, so we want to pull an image from a registry, we are going to specify Leon Devs / Docker Basics. As you can see in here, we are just passing the namespace or the user and then the repository we want to fetch. This is the exact same thing as pulling from docker.io / Leon Devs / Docker Basics and fetching the latest tag. If you don't use a server, Docker will assume you are using Docker Hub, docker.io. If we try to do this, you can see using default tag latest, and here you can see access is denied for this specific resource. And the reason is because this repository is private. We can execute Docker login, passing the username that we want to log into. In this case will be Leon Devs, and then the server. So we execute Docker login, then the U flag for specifying the username, and we are going to pass Leon Devs. In this case, you can see it is asking for the password and also mentions that you can create a personal access token in Docker Hub. So instead of putting your account password, you can just put your personal access token in here. I will just paste my password here and you can see login succeeded. So now if we try to execute the same pull again from docker.io / Leon Devs / Docker Basics, you can see we are using default tag latest, and here is the signature of the image that we have just downloaded. You can see it by execute Docker images, and here we have Leon Devs / Docker Basics. We can execute Docker run. We are going to remove this after we finish, and we are going to run this image. As you can see, we have our application listening in the 8080 port exactly as before. But wait, how is it that we are pulling a Docker image from the registry, but we never push that image to the registry? Well, I pushed this image to the registry just before this lesson, so I can show you how to pull a Docker image first. But now let's assume that we are making some changes in our application and we create a new version of our Docker image. We are fixing a bug or adding a new feature, whatever it is that we are doing in our application. After we finish, we execute Docker build, passing the T flag, and we are going to call this Docker Basics, and then we are going to pass the build context. Since we are inside the basics folder where we have our Docker file, you can see we are executing all the different layers of our application. And finally, in Docker images, you can see our image right here. And now, after making the change in our application, we want to push this image to the registry so we can pull that image from our production environment and actually execute the new version of our application. As you can see in here, what we have is our image called Docker Basics. Before pushing an image to a registry, you need to tag the image first. In Docker, every time we tag an image, what we are doing is adding the full path of the registry, the server, the username, all this configuration right here, because we have an image in our development environment, and whenever we push that image to the registry, we can push the same Docker image and we can tag the same Docker images for different servers and for different repositories, because we must be able to push the same Docker image to different Docker registries. That's why you need to tag your local image first using the full path that you want to tag. And once you have that, you can push this image that already contains the server, the username, and the repository and the tag. So that is what we are going to do here. We are going to execute Docker tag. We are going to tag this image in here, Docker Basics, that is our local Docker image. And we are going to tag this for docker.io / Leon Devs / Docker Basics, and we're going to use the latest tag. You can see whenever we tag this, if we execute Docker images, take a look at this. We use the full path docker.io / username / Docker basics and using the latest tag, but Docker created this repository right here, this Docker image right here, leondevs / Docker basics. Why is this? Because every time you use Docker.io, this is the standard server for Docker Hub. So in this case, the image doesn't contain the server, and latest is the default tag if you don't use a tag. So in our case, all this tag right here is the exact same thing as doing this. And once we have our image completely tagged, we can execute docker push, and we're going to push this image right here. By doing push, remember, we are just putting the username or the namespace and the repository. But Docker is adding Docker.io in here at the beginning and also adding latest to here. So whenever we push this, you can see the update right here. And if we go to Docker Hub, you can see inside this Docker basics, we have the tag latest created less than a minute ago. If we want to pull this image again, we can execute docker pull and just use in here username / Docker basics. And you can see right there, we are pulling the image that we just created. If we execute docker images, you can see our image right here. Now, if we execute docker logout, same as before, if you don't pass anything in here, Docker will log out from Docker Hub, will log out from docker.io. So executing docker logout or executing docker logout docker.io is the exact same thing. If we execute docker logout like this, you can see removing credentials for docker.io. Now, if we try to docker pull our image again, you can see access denied because we are not authenticated to Docker Hub. As you can see, using Docker Registries is really easy. The only thing that you need to remember is that if you don't pass the server and you don't pass the tag, Docker will always assume that you are talking with Docker.io and using the latest tag. If you don't pass the username, Docker will assume that you are interacting with docker.io / library. That's where all the public images are stored in Docker Hub. Of course, in here you can use whatever Docker registry you want. You could use Docker Hub, GitHub Container Registry, GitLab Registry, Google Container Registry, Amazon ECR, or you can host your own Docker registry, your self-host Docker registry. That's exactly what I'm doing in here, in this Raspberry Pi cluster in my home lab. You can just pick whatever Docker registry you want, and they work in the exact same way as we just seen. You just need to log in, tag an image that you want to push. Once you have the image tag, you can push it, and then you can download that from any environment using Docker as long as you are authenticated to that registry.